Hello there, and welcome to the Star Wars Guys YouTube channel. I am Master Paul,
And I am Mando on fire.
and today we're going to be talking about an article that Collider recently put out. It was an interview that they did with J.J. Abrams where he reflected on his experience working on the sequel trilogy, and he was asked about what would he have done differently with the sequel trilogy as far as planning it out. Would he have had a more concrete plan? So we're going to read this article. There's a video clip here, but we're not going to play that. We're just going to read the article. And a lot of what is said in this clip is transcribed later on, so we'll get to that. So, J.J. Abrams was never supposed to direct more than one film in the Star Wars franchise. When he was first approached about tackling Episode 7, he turned it down. It took some convincing on then new Lucasfilm head Kathleen Kennedy's part to get Abrams to agree to sign on, and in doing so, Abrams said at the time he was excited about the idea of creating a foundation from the ground up from which other stories might grow. Indeed, The Force Awakens had the unenviable task of introducing brand new characters that fans would want to follow while also servicing fans' desires to see old favorites back on screen. Abrams, co-writing the script with Lawrence Kasdan after Michael Arndt wrote the initial drafts, pulled it off, not only providing a satisfying conclusion to Han Solo's arc, debatedly, but also making the world fall in love with Rey, Finn, Poe, BB-8, etc. So clearly these are written by people that liked the sequel trilogy a lot. Because fall in love with Rey, Finn, Poe, BB-8, I don't know if I'd go that far with it. Even me, who is more forgiving these days with the sequel trilogy than most. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I would say that it was probably not like the best way to word it, like you said, but I would say it does seem pretty accurate just because this was because we have to remember this was a time before The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, so everyone was pretty chill with these new characters. So depending on how well they serve their roles, just because for one thing, they were new characters, just like you said. So us as human beings want to learn more about them naturally so that we can sort of fix the holes and find out the mysteries, just because, like I said, they're new characters, so we would naturally want to wonder who these characters really are in the Star Wars universe.
Right. Now, continue on. As Abrams was working on The Force Awakens, Lucasfilm wanted to get the next two films in the sequel trilogy off the ground, and thus hired Rian Johnson to write and direct Episode 8, and Colin Trevorrow to co-write and direct Episode 9. The idea being that each director would build off of what the previous filmmaker had crafted, leading to a sort of creative handoff from one director to the next. In Johnson's case, that meant following certain threads that Abrams built, like Rey's confrontation with Luke Skywalker, and dropping others, like Snoke. The Last Jedi was a critical success, but was divisive among some diehard fans owing to some of these decisions to veer left when it looked like Abrams was plotting a course to the right. It's probably a very polite way of putting that. So when Abrams signed on to take Episode 9 after Trevorrow left the project, or as some people would say, was fired, he had yet another unenviable task, albeit a completely different one. He had to finish a story he started, but one that had taken some alternate routes in its middle chapter, routes that Abrams wouldn't have necessarily gone down. The resulting film, The Rise of Skywalker, was similarly divisive as Abrams brought the story back around to some ideas he had been percolating while making The Force Awakens, specifically owing to Rey's parentage. Now, let's stop there for a quick second. About the idea of Rey's parentage, there was an interview that Rey did, I believe, with Josh Gad, and Daisy Ridley was asked by Josh Gad, did you know that Rey was going to be a Palpatine this whole time? And she said no. The ideas kept changing all the time, where One minute she was going to be a Kenobi, one minute she was going to be a Skywalker, the next she was going to be a nobody. And then when it came time to make Rise of Skywalker, they came to her and be like, "Okay, you're going to be a Palpatine." But then they came to her again saying, "You know what? Maybe we're not even that sure anymore." So so I don't think for a minute, they may claim this, but I don't think for a minute that J.J. Abrams intended for Rey to be a Palpatine right from the beginning stages of The Force Awakens. What do you think?
I would say that seems pretty accurate just because The Force Awakens' main goal was to establish new characters, a new story, and pretty much like the article said, pay homage to some of the original ideas of George Lucas and some of the original characters that he introduced. And so that all seems pretty accurate. And
Right.
furthermore, her her Rise of Skywalker, as you said, served the purpose of finishing J.J. Abrams' story with a few alterations, let's just say, to work with that Brian Johnson had created with The Last Jedi. That's, like the article says, were pretty divisive, and kind of like how you said it, that's a pretty polite way to say things.
Right. And then this next article is pretty much about the author giving his opinion on the creative handoff between Abrams and Johnson, as he says, saying that he felt that The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi felt like distinct films, each following themes and threads that these two different filmmakers sparked to, but others blame this creative handoff for perceived problems with the sequel trilogy and claim that it would have been better had Abrams and or Lucasfilm planned out the three-movie arc from the very beginning, which is exactly what George Lucas did with the previous two trilogies. He may not have made he may not have directed all three of the original trilogy movies himself, but he did have the idea for where the series was going to go. And he was there helping make sure that the story went the way that he wanted. And then the article goes on saying, "So when I spoke to Abrams recently for a press day celebrating the 10th anniversary of his film Super 8, never seen that, I asked him about his creative handoff. And here's the important part. Specifically, does he feel the Star Wars trilogy would have benefited from having a plan from the very beginning?" Now, before we get into JJ's response, Michael, what's your answer for this? The would the Star Wars sequel trilogy have benefited from having a plan from the very beginning?
I would at least argue some form of a plan. Like, obviously, you wouldn't have all the nitty gritty details planned out from the start, but you should have somewhat of a clear idea of what story you want to tell. And kind of to
Right.
play devil's advocate for like a couple of minutes, some would argue that George Lucas's vision for the original trilogy did change just because this at one point in time, Darth Vader, or just had the name Darth Vader just because that was like his name. But then Darth eventually turned into a Sith title, and then come around episode 5, they changed Vader to be Luke's father, and those were like somewhat of last minute changes, but not really. But
Right.
it's a when we look at the prequel trilogy, it was clear from the very beginning what story George Lucas wanted to tell. How we get
Exactly.
to the original whole trilogy where pretty much all the Jedi are no more, and yes, even have a little bit of a reference to you fought in the Clone Wars, and basically tell the story somewhat of what happened at that time. Basically, how did we get from good to bad? Pretty much
E-
is what the
yes.
prequel trilogy served. Now, like I said,
Exactly.
not all the details were planned out, and a couple of things could have been executed a little bit more. But it's not about having a full fledged out plan, but it's about having a rough vision. Like, what is the overall theme, or what's the overall story that you want to tell?
Okay. I can agree with that. So, my answer, just plain and simple, is yes. The sequel trilogy should have been perhaps not to the very nth degree of detail, but just the major story beats across all three movies should really have been set in stone by the time filming ever began. Now, I want you to listen to what J.J. Abrams' answer is and how he gets there. So, again, here's the question. Does J.J. Abrams feel the Star Wars trilogy would have benefited from having a plan from the very beginning? In answering, Abrams drew from his wealth of experience in television. Quote, I've been involved in a number of projects that have been, in most cases, series that have ideas that begin with the thing where you feel like you know where it's going to go. And sometimes it's an actor who comes in, other times it's a relationship that, as written, doesn't quite work. And things that you think are going to be just so well received just crash and burn. And other things that you think, like, oh, that's a small amount, or that's a one episode character, suddenly become a huge, important part of the story. I feel like what I've learned as a lesson a few times now, and it's something that, especially in this pandemic year, working with writers has become clear. The lesson is that you have to plan things as best you can, and you always need to be able to respond to the unexpected. And the unexpected can come in all sorts of forms. And I do think there's nothing more important than knowing where you're going. Abrams acknowledged that sometimes the plan is the thing. Actually, no, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, yeah, this last line here, and the unexpected can come in all sorts of forms, and I do think there's nothing more important than knowing where you're going. So, really, it's this part here. I do think there's nothing more important than knowing where you're going. That's really all we needed. We didn't need all this stuff up here. It's literally it's basically a yes or a no question that he gave basically his whole career story on, as far as what he's learned for TV, that we really don't need to know. It's just, you know, did there need to be a plan? Yes or no? And perhaps a simple answer of why. What do you think?
I do think that, well, I can honestly say I don't really watch a lot of J.J. Abrams' work, so I really can't tell
I
like
know you've
what
seen
kind of.
Lost though.
Yeah, I know I've seen that, but like outside of that, I haven't really watched it. So given that, I really can't tell you what his style is. But basically, what I'm taking away from is that, especially in that last part where he said that I do think that there's nothing more important than knowing where you're going. I think that's our yes answer, which is probably all we would
Yes.
need. But then he kind of extends this idea where we have to be prepared for the unexpected, which I would say is true, and true for anything in life, whether it to be television or literally just whatever happens. It's almost like the idea of hope for the best but prepare for the worst sort of thing.
Right. And if you wanted to go into that, basically what I would have said had I been asked that question is, oh, yes, and here's why. And I would say it in as clear and concise a way as possible. For
Mm-hmm.
example, and I know you know what I'm talking about this with Michael,
Mm-hmm.
would you suppose you want to go to a certain type of tourist attraction? Would you like to have a tour guide that rambles on and goes into every little bit of detail, or would you prefer to have a tour guide that's as clear and concise as possible?
Obviously, you would want to be as clear as concise.
Yes. And what we're getting here from JJ is a whole bunch of useless rambling, at least to me. And then he continues on. Abrams acknowledged that sometimes the plan is the thing that gets in the way. There are projects that I've worked on where we had some ideas, but we hadn't worked through them enough. And sometimes we had some ideas, but that we weren't allowed to do them the way we wanted to. I've had all sorts of situations where you plan things in a certain way and you suddenly find yourself doing something that's 180 degrees different. And then sometimes it works really well. and you feel like, wow, that really came together. And other times you think, oh my God, I can't believe this is where we are. And then sometimes when it's not working out, it's because it's what you planned. And other times when it's not working, it's because you didn't have a plan. But ultimately, the filmmaker said that he's, quote, learned the hard way that it's better to have a plan and be willing or able to change it than not have one at all. You just never really know. But having a plan, I have learned in some cases the hard way, is the most critical thing, because otherwise you don't know what you're setting up. This is the really important part. You don't know what you're setting up. You don't know what to emphasize, because if you don't know the inevitable of the story, you're just as good as your last sequence or effect or joke or whatever, but you want to be leading to something inevitable. And then down here, just giving different examples from other sources, which we don't need to talk about that. So, back that last thing that he said, it's important to have a plan because you don't know what you're supposed to be setting up. I can think of a couple examples off the top of my head of some of stuff that JJ wanted to set up to be important but never get followed up on in The Last Jedi, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for
Yeah.
example, Rey's force vision when she touches the lightsaber, who who Snoke is, who um who Rey's parents are. That's probably the biggest one. And especially, you know, basically the immediate aftermath of Rey handing over the lightsaber to Luke. We either get no explanation for those, or what we do get is so backwards and unsatisfying and frustrating that is like, why? Like, what was the point of getting invested in this in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately, I'm glad that J.J. Abrams is finally saying this, but it's like, also, why didn't you do this from the beginning? Because if you had planned out the sequel trilogy all the way through 7 through 9, if you had planned it out, we wouldn't even be talking about this, right? We
Mm-hmm.
would instead, you know, to some extent, be talking about the movies themselves, what we like about them, what we didn't like about them, instead of having to have, these conversations of, you screwed up in making these movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I would also agree to, and I don't know. For me personally, I can't really feel. I kind of feel bad for him just because, well, really from the get go, this whole idea of handing off something
Mm-hmm.
was obviously a bad idea, just because each director has their own unique style. Now, keep in mind,
Right.
I've actually never seen anything else that Rian Johnson has directed, so anybody who watches this can comment some examples of his style, or like what his way of directing is, as opposed to J.J. Abrams. So somebody in the comments can type that in for us. It'll do us a great favor. Also, while we're at it, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. So
Thanks for
selfless
plugging that.
self shameless self promotion. There you go. But in all seriousness, this is, like I said, each director has their own vision. So if we were to follow through with JJ starting off pretty good, and then Rian Johnson starting off um, not good, and then Colin Trevorrow, I've actually seen a couple of his movies, such as Jurassic World. He was the main director for that series, and I want to
Okay.
say I did like his movies, even though that they do feel a little bit more different from Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams. But my main point is that because you have different visions and different ideas from different directors, there's bound to be a mess in the first place. Now, of course,
Right.
had there been like a constant, say, if Dave Filoni or JJ stayed with the project and was pretty much like an assistant director to kind of
Mm-hmm.
help follow through with the story more, then it would have been better. No matter if it was JJ, no matter who named was under the words directed by J.J. Abrams, Ryan Johnson, Colin Trevorrow. We don't care. As long as there's
Right.
something that remains the same, being somebody
And
that
there's
we
a
know in leadership.
and there's a great example of that currently going on in Lucasfilm. This show right here is a great
Yes.
example of handing from one director to the next, but still having an overall plan. And that's
Yeah.
one reason why The Mandalorian is so much more popular than the sequel trilogy, because Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni have actually planned out where they want the series to go, and they're just basically hiring on these different directors saying,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you guys are going to be the vehicle for how we get there.
Yeah. And such examples of directors were Taika Waititi, who also plays his IG 11, I believe, in The
I think
Mandalorian,
you're right. I think you're
and
right.
he also directed Thor Ragnarok and also voiced Korg. And
And
we
he
also have
and he
people,
directed the season 1 finale.
yeah, and he also, and then Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni also hired people like Bryce Dallas Howard, who we know to be the main female role in Jurassic World. Also, Gwen Stacy
Mhm.
from the Tobey Maguire universe, Spider-Man 3.
Right?
So different directors who have their own set of, uh, basically making their own work, but Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni still overseeing the project. Even George Lucas was involved himself, which made things
Right.
infinitely better.
Right. And even if you had to have different directors, that's really all we're asking, and this is kind of where we'll wrap up. If if they can do this for a TV show, have one story all the way through but have multiple different directors take a part of it, if they can do for a TV show, there's no excuse for why they couldn't do it for a movie, but they thought that they could get away with the mentality of it's Star Wars, they'll buy it no matter what. And that's where we're going to wrap up. So, thank you guys for watching this. As Michael said earlier, make sure to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. And we will see you guys on Sunday about, we'll say about 6 p.m. Eastern on Sunday for our weekly live stream where we will go over the Bad Batch as always. And Michael will be doing his tier list for every single live action lightsaber fight. So, hope to see you guys there. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.